Angelica simply couldn't understand why she, whose instantaneous techniques were unmatched in the world, couldn't even defeat a lowly adventurer today. Worse, the male protagonist suspected her of having secured her position in the Knight's Order through backdoor connections. Little did she know that to Rick, her movements appeared as slow as a snail's. Rick couldn't help but wonder if he might actually be stronger after all, which was understandable given that his masters were the strongest adventurers on the continent, and the training he had undergone was nothing short of hellish. The constant belittlement from his masters led him to believe that they represented only the starting point of combat power on the continent. After successfully graduating, Rick planned to register his level at the Adventurers Guild. He learned that to obtain an adventurer's identity, he would need to pass a test. No sooner had he completed the procedures than a drunkard approached the front desk, causing trouble. With a spirit of helping others, Rick quickly patted the man's chest to sober him up, and sure enough, the man immediately quieted down, even frothing at the mouth in gratitude to Rick. Seeing that the situation was getting out of hand, Rick quickly smoothed things over by claiming he had been confused by the alcohol and advised the onlookers not to drink counterfeit alcohol like he had. After obtaining his examination slip, when Elfelt, his master, inquired about his progress, Rick, distractedly staring at a woman with large breasts, gave irrelevant answers. Unbeknownst to Rick, the front desk was in chaos by then. His handprint had even left an imprint on a steel armor. Moreover, someone recognized the drunk man's identity. He was an A-class criminal recently wanted by the authorities. Soon, the first magic test began. Most participants were above level D, but when it was Rick's turn, everyone laughed at him. However, unbeknownst to them, as Rick left, the crystal ball cracked. The examiner, however, didn't care, assuming it was normal wear and tear. Then came the strength test, where the examiner scored participants based on the damage they inflicted on slime-filled punching bags. Rick was initially afraid, having trained with a golden slime as hard as dragon's teeth. Soon, a wealthy heir took the stage, hailed by all as a prodigious genius. Rick was curious about his strength. The heir struck a supremely cliched pose, drawing everyone's attention. However, when he launched a fireball, though it was very small, it received lavish praise from the audience. Rick, knowing that his lowly master could unleash fireballs not only larger, but also of nation-destroying power, began to suspect that the wealthy heir was deliberately suppressing his power. If so, he truly was a genius. When it was Rick's turn, seeing that he was a 30-year-old newbie adventurer and considering his poor magic test results, the examiner advised Rick to give up on becoming an adventurer. Rick was almost persuaded to quit, but remembering his years of effort, he assumed his strongest attack posture and smashed the punching bag. Despite the wealthy heir's displeasure, he restrained himself and proceeded to the next test. Unexpectedly, Rick not only easily defended against a 4th-tier magic attack, but also declared his intention to challenge a 5th-tier spell. Hearing this, the examiner became furious, feeling underestimated, and launched a powerful attack. As expected, the 5th-tier spell shattered the defensive barrier, but Rick remained completely unharmed. The Knight Captain's attention was captured by the tremendous uproar. Learning that Rick not only effortlessly blocked a 5th-tier magic spell, but also shattered a slime-filled punching bag with his bare hands, the Knight Captain became interested. After all the tests were completed, the wealthy heir came to cause trouble again. Annoyed by Rick stealing the spotlight all day, he was not pleased, but he wasn't foolish either. He directly brought in his sister Angelica, a 2nd-class knight of the kingdom, planning to teach Rick a lesson. Angelica casually threw her glove at Rick as a challenge for a duel. Rick, mistaking the glove for a free gift, was unaware that picking up the glove in the kingdom meant accepting the duel. With no choice, Rick followed her to the duel arena. As per tradition, both duelists could make a victory demand. Angelica demanded that the loser serve the winner until death, which seemed like an easy condition. However, Rick panicked upon hearing 2nd-class knight, comparable to a B-class adventurer, and even vomited on the spot, thinking he was just an F-class weakling. Encouraged by Elfelt, Rick gathered himself to face the duel. Angelica planned to intimidate Rick right from the start, so she buffed herself and launched her attack, instantly slicing through the iron bars behind her. Seeing Rick's shocked expression, she thought her move had intimidated him, but Rick was only rubbing his eyes in disbelief. When she attacked again, Rick found it too slow. Is this the Night Order's strength? He wondered. Unable to believe it, as her speed was comparable to a first-class knight, Angelica accelerated and executed her fastest sword technique. To Rick, however, it still seemed as slow as a snail. Just then, Angelica unexpectedly kicked a stone, causing her body to spin out uncontrollably like a windmill. This disorderly attack made Rick dismiss his thoughts of being strong. To ease the awkwardness, Angelica, trying to maintain composure, praised Rick for evading even such an attack and declared she would get serious now. She then used her tri-foot kill, a move she could only perform 3 times. Rick easily dodged it again. Angelica panicked. The move was too draining, but determined not to lose the duel, she used it again, only to be dodged once more. With only one chance left, she went all in. But another mishap occurred. A stone on the ground tripped her, causing her to fly low across the ground. Rick, thinking she was aiming for a crippling blow, stopped her with a punch, but accidentally used too much force, creating a huge crater. Angelica was dumbfounded, realizing she might have been knocked out if not for the trip. Rick regretted that his punch had deviated again. Terrified, Angelica asked who he was. Rick replied that he was just the worst F-class adventurer, a claim she couldn't believe. With no choice but to continue the duel, Rick was ready to fight, but for her own safety, Angelica quickly surrendered. As Rick was still in shock, she turned and left swiftly. But Rick wasn't foolish. "What about the stakes we agreed on?" he reminded. Angelica, realizing her predicament, turned pale and ran off quickly. That might have been the fastest she moved today. The novice Uncle Rick never expected that he would accidentally join the legendary team of adventurers, only to live a life like hell every day. After training desperately for 2.5 years, he unknowingly became the strongest S-rank adventurer on the surface. To him, mighty dragons were like toys. However, because he had never left the mountain during his training and was often ridiculed by his masters, Rick always thought he was still weak. A simple level 1 exam made Rick extremely nervous, only because Elfelt had once said that failing the exam would mean doubling the training workload upon returning, which was no different from a death sentence. Fortunately, he successfully passed the first stage of the assessment, and his hanging heart was finally able to relax. Just as he was preparing to leave, a pungent smell suddenly filled the air. A self-proclaimed handsome man named Raster approached to flirt with Elfelt. He was the eldest son of Duke Diarmoit, and the brother of Fried and Angelica, whom Rick had encountered earlier. Rick initially thought Raster was also a candidate and tried to greet him, but was met with a look of utter disdain. Raster then took Elfelt by the hand, started spouting cheesy love lines, and even proposed to make her his second wife. At this, Elfelt's eyes instantly filled with murderous intent. Seeing trouble, Rick quickly interrupted Raster, claiming that Elfelt was his girlfriend and that he couldn't just stand by. Raster, dismissive, laughed when he saw Rick's exam certificate. He couldn't help but mock Rick, noting that at Rick's age, he was still stuck at F rank, whereas he himself had advanced to E rank at the age of 14 and was now not only an A rank adventurer, but also the examiner for the second stage mock battle. Despite this, Elfelt still rejected his invitation. Angered and embarrassed, Raster vowed that if he became Rick's examiner in the second stage, he would show Elfelt the gap in strength between them, convinced that she would surely change her mind. At this point, Rick was speechless and prayed that he wouldn't encounter Raster. Suddenly, he felt a pressure on his arm and realized that Elfelt had been holding on to him the whole time. He also apologized to Elfelt for claiming she was his girlfriend without her consent, but she seemed quite happy with it. Unbeknownst to them, once Raster returned, Fried and Angelica complained to their brother about being bullied by Rick, swearing to make Rick understand the consequences of angering the nobility. The next day, as the mock battle was about to begin, Rick was extremely anxious, worried about actually facing Raster as the examiner. Then, a middle-aged man suddenly appeared with good news. His name was Lynx, and he was assigned as Rick's examiner for the mock battle. Hearing this, Rick was overjoyed. Lynx had sought out Rick after hearing about his determination, which greatly inspired him as a fellow middle-aged adventurer who had also started his career at the age of 24, harboring similar dreams. Although it took him 20 years to barely reach B rank. Even so, determined to climb to A rank to realize his dream, Rick found that Lynx, despite his age, was still fighting with a fiery passion, seeming like a friend with similar aspirations. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation was fully overheard by Raster, who was hiding nearby. When they reached the resting room, Rick thought he was lucky this time. But then, a staff member brought dire news. The originally assigned examiner, Lynx, had suddenly fallen ill, and Raster would be taking over as the examiner. This news terrified Rick so much that he choked. Other candidates also murmured complaints, because Raster, a noble from a distinguished family, had reached A rank at just 17 years old, not only hailed as a genius, but also known as the F-rank Terminator. It was rumored that he enjoyed tormenting the candidates he set his sights on each year. Hearing this, Rick paced nervously back and forth, afraid of being targeted by such a narrow-minded person, fearing the inhumane training that awaited him if he failed. Rick's lack of confidence stemmed from his late start compared to others, and his efforts along the way were often dismissed by others. Seeing this, Elfelt comforted him, saying that if one's confidence could be shaken by the words of others, conversely, it could also be stimulated by the words of others. Elfelt firmly believed that Rick was strong and would definitely pass the exam. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted. Freed, fully disguised, sweet-talked Rick, falsely offering to divine his fortune for free. Rick, unsuspecting, thought it would be a good omen before the mock battle. However, Elfelt felt something was off. The moment Rick sat down, a teleportation magic circle appeared on the stool. Before she could stop him, Rick was transported somewhere else. The next second, Elfelt reprimanded Freed. Meanwhile, Rick was transported outside the examination venue, confused and lost, when suddenly a group of people surrounded him. They were Raster's personal guard, intending to prevent Rick from participating in the exam. All present were adventurers of B rank and above. If Rick failed because of this, it would be embarrassing. At that moment, a voice was heard from afar. Rick's masters suddenly appeared. Rick was about to explain when he saw the minions behind him, so he lied, claiming they were just sparring before the exam. His bald master found this amusing and immediately offered to help. Rick panicked at once, urging the butler to lead people to flee, afraid they would all die here. But the butler, disdainful, immediately ordered them to be killed. However, the bloodbath Rick imagined did not occur. Instead, weapons shattered all over the ground. This infuriated the man, who then threw his weapon and violently attacked with his fists, only for his punch to be easily caught by the bald master. The next second, his palm was crushingly fractured, leaving the man in immense shock and fear. However, what was even more unexpected was that the opponent merely chanted for a moment, and the originally shattered palm was instantly healed. The bald master patiently instructed the weakling, telling him not to focus solely on strengthening his arms, but to always be aware that the body functions as a whole. This scene made the butler sweat profusely, and he seemed to faintly guess the identity of the other party. In fact, Master Mizet knew at a glance that they were here to cause trouble and immediately offered to resolve the situation peacefully for Rick. He then pulled out an American-style katana and started firing without a word, emptying the magazine and stunning Rick. Seeing the situation worsen, the man instantly took a little girl hostage. Upon seeing this, Rick urged the man to let her go quickly. However, the weakling was not likely to listen to reason, and she cast a high-level magic spell. At this moment, the butler also understood the identities of the group. The little girl, only 10 years old, was known as the strongest genius magician vampire in history. Mizet was a mix of dwarf and elf, possessing technology that seemed millennia ahead. The bald orc, both a monstrous creature of strength and possessing wisdom, along with the others, were not only the world's strongest S-rank adventurers, but also members of the legendary Orichalcum Fist squad. The butler never expected to see them with his own eyes one day, and immediately decided to retire, returning to the countryside to live out his life peacefully farming. Rick said he needed to go back and try hard on the exam and hurried away. At the same time, Freed was smug, believing that Rick, having been teleported away, could not safely return, especially with the family guard waiting for him. But unexpectedly, Rick suddenly appeared. Elfelt tossed Freed aside like trash. Just then, Lynx, weakened, walked over. From his mouth, Rick learned that Raster wanted to be Rick's examiner so badly that he had knocked him down deliberately, even asking about his own dreams. When he revealed his dream of building a school for aspiring adventurers in his remote hometown, he was brutally beaten and mocked, then locked up in a dark room. Although resentful, he could not refute Raster's words. He advised Rick to better give up on the exam, as the other party would definitely use all means to torment him. However, Rick interrupted him, insisting, "It's never too late to try new things, no matter how old one is." At that moment, Rick, extremely angered, immediately headed to the exam venue to teach Raster a lesson. Seeing his own guards shaking, Raster realized Rick had arrived. He had wanted Rick to lose his qualifications, to feel a devastating sense of powerlessness. But now that Rick had chosen to take the exam, he was ready to ruthlessly trample on his boring efforts and passion, to show him a fear that would make even hell pale in comparison. But Rick was not someone to be trifled with. Raster could never have imagined that his proudly wielded super-tier magic would be so weak in front of Rick. Rick, who was just a lowly F-rank middle-aged man, somehow managed to make Raster, an elite, flee in panic. Little did anyone know, Rick might appear as an F-rank on the surface, but under his monstrously strong master, he had trained to the death for 2.5 years, elevating his strength to that of the strongest S-rank adventurer on the surface. However, due to frequent mocking by his masters, Rick always thought he was still weak, despite being able to easily shatter a 2.5-ton boulder, a feat even an F-rank adventurer could accomplish. Undeterred, Rick decided to step into the E-rank promotion exam, determined to teach Raster a lesson for trampling on others' dreams. Alika, witnessing this, was very worried because she had heard that Raster liked to use his strength to utterly crush the examinees. However, the masters were not worried at all. Seeing Rick's arrival, Raster did not expect that his opponent could escape from his personal guard. If so, he was ready to crush Rick's boring efforts and passion. But before that, Rick curiously asked Raster why he chose to be an adventurer, only to find Raster's disdain for adventurers. Being a noble with high innate talent, Raster viewed adventuring merely as a way to increase his market value, planning to resign at any convenient reason. However, facing his own launched magic, Rick did not move, thinking he was frightened. Unknown to Raster, Rick was extremely angry after hearing his words, but remembered what Elfelt had told him before the exam, to stay absolutely calm and closely observe his opponent. Although he did not understand Elfelt's intent, he trusted her judgment. Then Raster unleashed a third-tier magic, intending to crush Rick's dreams in one blow. But what he never expected was that Rick, with just his physical body, could resist the third-tier magic unscathed, shocking Elisa. But Master told her not to worry too much. The magical power of adventurers is very special. If not strengthened before the age of 20, it cannot grow later on. Rick began adventuring at 30, making his magical power minuscule. Therefore, his bald master subjected him to inhuman physical training, each leg weighed down with 100 kilograms, desperately crossing a den filled with carnivorous, magical beasts. After 2.5 years of training, Rick had already reached the S-rank realm, although he himself did not realize it. Meanwhile, Raster never thought that the S-rank old man he never took seriously could, with just his physical strength, effortlessly block the magic he was so proud of. Thinking Rick was just a durable punching bag, he aimed to completely defeat him in his own domain. However, Rick punched him back, finally understanding the meaning behind Elfelt's words. Raster, relying on his innate talent, had never truly studied magic. Although his magical power was immense, beyond that, he was a mess. Faced with someone who only depleted his own talents, it seemed impossible to lose. Seeing Rick suddenly full of confidence, Raster was arrogantly proud, thinking Rick had just accidentally caught the timing to neutralize the attack. This time, his fully chanted magic's explosive power would surely be too much for him to handle, but Rick simply blocked it with one hand. Seeing this, Raster lunged at Rick, planning a sneak attack. Unexpectedly, Rick countered with a punch. Raster was completely taken aback. He had not anticipated that Rick was hiding his true strength, which seemed to be beyond E rank. Meanwhile, mockingly saying that Rick was really lucky. However, Rick retorted that what he had used was not even magic, but mere physical control, yet its precision far surpassed your enhanced magic. Raster was skeptical. With Rick's meager amount of magical power and at his age, how could he possibly become so strong in just 2.5 years? Hearing this, Rick trembled slightly. His master had once left him in a dragon's nest, not allowing him to leave until he defeated the dragon, enduring bombing under 200 kilograms of weight and facing inhumane torture, repeatedly breaking and repairing, which drastically transformed Rick's body. Although Rick said this, Raster didn't believe him at all. Even if there was such harsh training, what did he rely on to keep going? Without hesitation, Rick said, to become an adventurer and defeat the world's strongest magical creature, Kaiser Yalu. This made Raster laugh out loud because, in everyone's impression, Kaiser Yalu was just a monster from storybooks. But little did they know, this ultimate magical creature really existed and was their ultimate goal. Seeing this, Raster didn't bother listening to Rick's nonsense and decided to end things with Rick for good. He casually released a 7th-tier magic to bind and restrain Rick, followed by an 8th-tier magic. Watching the tree man appear, Rick was not at all flustered and concentrated all his energy in his hand. However, Raster mocked him, saying, "A mere 1st-tier chi punch, and you think it can shake the human pinnacle of 8th-tier magic?" But what Raster didn't know was that Rick's chi punch had been practiced 100 million times over 2.5 years. Although physically impossible, it could be achieved with special space-time magic, and Rick achieved it through his indomitable will. Of course, Raster wouldn't believe it and didn't plan to let Rick continue boasting. With his strongest strike, he intended to completely shatter Rick and the middle-aged examiner's dreams. The two forces collided violently. Rick continued to exert force, but Raster's tree man began to crumble. With Rick's shout, the 8th-tier magic was ultimately shattered. The onlookers couldn't believe it. Rick, a candidate, had defeated an A-rank examiner. Afterwards, Rick returned to the resting room to find his masters waiting for him. After this battle, he realized he really had become stronger and was very thankful for his master's help and training. Just then, a bruised Raster walked in. Although Raster's previous actions had been excessive, Rick still gave him advice. The reason he lost was because he had honed his techniques to perfection. He advised Raster to seriously study a single magic. Whether Raster took the advice was unknown, but as he left, he dropped a harsh word, saying that next time when Rick took the upgrading exam and he was his examiner again, he would definitely win. As evening approached, the announcements for those who passed the E-rank exam were gradually broadcasted. But Elfelt noticed a drastic change in Rick's mindset. He seemed to have remembered a lot of things. Rick had been identified as possessing a special skill from a young age, but he had not awakened it for 30 years. He had resigned himself to never becoming an adventurer. However, when faced with a dragon, he unexpectedly awakened his special skill. With one arm, he blocked the dragon's attack and then unleashed a surprising burst of power, shocking Elfelt, who was nearby. At that moment, Rick was exhilarated and decided to use the dragon as practice. He effortlessly blocked the dragon's attacks with a barrier and then counterattacked, instantly slaying the dragon with a dazzling laser. Originally, after defeating Raster, Rick remembered being told in his early childhood that he possessed a special skill, which excited him immensely. He had looked forward to awakening this special skill every day, but decades passed. The dream of becoming an adventurer had faded, and Rick had become a desk clerk at the Adventurers Guild, dealing with endless social obligations and mundane tasks. However, one night, after drinking with his boss until midnight, Rick encountered a maid, Elfelt, on his way home. Sensing danger, he instinctively protected her, but Elfelt, who was not at all afraid of the monster, killed it immediately. During a casual conversation afterward, Rick discovered that Elfelt was an S-rank adventurer, a level he never thought he'd encounter in his lifetime. Rick promptly asked her out to dinner, half expecting her to refuse, but she agreed right away, which thrilled Rick immensely. The next day, Rick felt as if he had won a big prize and was extremely excited. He barely made it through the workday, with his mind full of the upcoming date with Elfelt. However, many monsters suddenly appeared in the town. When he rushed to the scene, he found that Elfelt had already taken action. She quickly dispatched a large number of monsters, but suddenly, terrifying memories from her childhood surfaced in her mind. She realized that there must be a powerful dragon nearby, because her body showed symptoms similar to trauma. Whenever she sensed the dragon's magic, she lost her ability to fight. 3 B-rank adventurers from the guild came to help, but they were no match for the dragon. Just when everyone was in despair, Rick stepped forward alone and faced the dragon. The next second, the dragon slapped him to the ground. It seemed certain that his small frame would not survive, but Rick, bearing the dragon's hit, stood up, visibly radiating magic power. The awakened Rick, thrilled with his new power, easily killed the dragon with a single strike. People watched his victorious silhouette, somewhat at a loss. The man could never have imagined that a candidate who had just advanced to E-rank adventurer would have 4 S-rank masters. One was a seemingly innocent little lowly, whose casual spells were comparable to 6th-tier magic. Another, thought to be a maid hired for money, could lift monsters weighing several tons with one hand alone. Then there was a seemingly careless blonde, whose newly invented prototype could instantly destroy everything, and a book-loving orc who could kill an A-rank dragon with a single punch. This made him even more regretful of his own foolishness. It was not long before he learned that Rick had passed the E-rank adventurer exam. To celebrate, Lynx wanted to have a drink with him and meet Rick's masters. However, he didn't realize that this casual mention would nearly send him to the Ghost Gate. He didn't understand why Rick insisted he come fully armed. Soon, he arrived at an area enveloped in thick fog. After confirming several times that this was Rick's home, he decided to knock on the door. He walked directly to a smaller side door, only to be shocked to see Rick coming out of an unreasonably large door. What made him even more curious was that he hadn't seen any monsters along the way. If there was no danger, why did he need to be fully armed? Just as he voiced this question, Rick said it was so that he wouldn't need to be put in a coffin. At that moment, Rick opened the house's main door, and a maid was already waiting inside. Lynx didn't pay much attention to this, simply assuming Rick's family was wealthy. But just then, Drockwell called out to Rick and unleashed a spell of 6th-tier power. Rick deflected the attack. It was only when Rick addressed Drockwell as senior that Lynx realized this was one of Rick's masters, and their earlier action was just their usual play. But they shouldn't have been playing inside the house. Upon hearing Elfelt mention that the repair costs would be deducted from Drockwell's meal expenses, Drockwell collapsed in dismay. Later, to avoid further trouble from Drockwell, Rick decided to accompany her for a while and let Lynx explore on his own, because Elfelt merely let him roam freely and walked away, but such a large place required a guide. Just as he was about to wait for Rick to return, he suddenly saw a blonde outside assembling a strange weapon. Curiosity got the better of him, and he started inquiring. Fortunately, Mizette already knew he was Rick's friend and patiently explained that this was his latest invention. Rather than just listening, it was better to try it out. After explaining how to use it, Mizette found him a target for shooting. The moment he pulled the trigger, the missile caused astonishing damage, and the strong recoil knocked him down. Realizing Mizette was not to be trifled with, Lynx dared not wander further. But as he returned the same way, he suddenly discovered an orc reading a book inside the house. This contradictory scene instantly piqued his curiosity again. Upon learning that the orc was another of Rick's masters, he immediately asked if he could also receive some guidance. This also made Ashork pause for a moment, because Lynx's gaze reminded him of Rick. After a brief consideration, he decided to give it a try. They went to a cliff, where the training method was too much for Lynx to handle. Just when he thought he was going to die, he was caught by something soft. But then he realized that this was all just preparation for their dinner tonight, which made him instantly realize that everyone in Rick's family should not be underestimated. Telling himself the reason he ended up here was because Ashork had pushed him off the cliff, Lynx was surprised to find that Elfelt seemed to treat it as normal, since Ashork had caused Rick's death the most times so far. While Lynx was still confused, Ashork came over to his side. After searching for a long time, Ashork found Lynx in such a place and took him for training again. Fortunately for Lynx, he still managed to survive. Seeing his miserable state, Rick also sympathized with him, knowing all too well the terror of his masters. However, after understanding everything, Lynx gradually calmed down. During dinner, he became curious about Rick's inherent skills. He asked about them, but it was as if he hadn't asked at all. However, Ashork explaining that Rick's skills are conditionally activated, meaning he cannot activate them on his own, knowing that even without skills, Rick had already reached the S rank level. One could imagine how powerful he would be once activated. Ashok was confident that Rick could surpass them and be the key to defeating the strongest monster, Kaiser. Just when Lynx was a bit dumbfounded, Ashok suddenly asked him if he had ever heard of the 6 orbs. The so-called 6 orbs are the keys to unlocking the sleeping place of Kaiser, and now was the time when they were active. Although Lynx was shocked to hear this, since Kaiser is a part of the Grand Legends, he had some clues about the 6 orbs. After telling everyone the location, they arrived at the Adventurers Guild early the next morning. However, to their surprise, the guild leader was very rigid, requiring 4 people to take on a quest. Just as they were worrying about what to do, Lynx suddenly saw Ray, who had just come to work. He remembered Ray saying that she wanted to experience a high-risk task. Now the opportunity had come. Although it suited Ray's intentions, she couldn't tell that the 3 people in front of her were experts. But then she thought that this was a great opportunity to show her skills. After agreeing on the spot, she quickly set off with the 3 of them, just as she had expected. She felt that this task was not dangerous at all, and perhaps it could even be a chance for her to showcase her abilities and make the guild leader see her in a new light. However, soon after arriving at their destination, Ray realized that her thoughts were gravely mistaken. She never expected that the 3 were planning to stir up trouble in a dragon's nest. Considering that even the weakest dragon is of A rank, and as the name suggests, there isn't just one in a nest, this was sheer overestimation of their abilities. Ray's worries annoyed Ashok, so he had Rick send her away. Ray agreed without hesitation, as staying there would mean certain death. However, what slightly infuriated her was why Rick wouldn't take everyone away together. Staying would clearly lead to a dead end. Then, what happened next completely exceeded her expectations. As a dragon fell dead before her, followed by a second and a third, dragons were being knocked out of the sky every second. But at that moment, one dragon set its sights on them. Ray immediately recognized that this was no ordinary beast, but one that even several A-rank adventurers couldn't defeat. Just as she thought of running away, to her surprise, Rick instead moved forward, seemingly marching towards his demise. She knew Rick was only E-rank, but when he told her it was okay for her to escape, she felt insulted, which made her decide to fight to the death. Ray was shocked when Rick, against all odds, knocked out the red dragon with a single punch. After returning, Ray could no longer focus on her job and decided to resign to become an adventurer like Rick. While the guild leader was at a loss for words, Rick had already returned home. Although they only found one of the 6 orbs on this trip, Huang Mao, as the technical expert of the team, could locate the positions of the other orbs through resonance. Discovering that the nearest one was in a major city nearby, they prepared to set off. What Rick didn't know was that at this very moment, Angelica was in that city. The man never expected that his pride and his sneak attack tactics would be so feeble and ineffective in front of Rick. A punch that could easily shatter a 2.5-ton boulder, yet it was he who ended up injured. Rick's punch was just an ordinary one, yet it nearly split the earth in half, as if he saw his great-grandmother waving at him. Just before this, Rick and his companions had come to the kingdom of Heracles in search of the orb. In this country where athletics thrive, being a fighter is an extremely popular profession. They were planning to go to the Adventurers Guild to gather information about the orb, when they unexpectedly discovered a bald man harassing a young girl in broad daylight in an alley. Rick was about to intervene, but Ashok took the initiative, thinking about asking them, only to be mocked by the bald man. As a fighter, he did not take the orc seriously at all, even suggesting that Ashok join him in the alley to talk about life. But after he was beaten, he became compliant. Then Rick opened the orb, wanting to know if the two had seen anything similar before. Unexpectedly, both had indeed seen it before. While the bald man was deep in thought, cheers erupted continuously behind him, all because the Boxing King Championship was about to begin in 2 months. This championship, which determines the champion of fighters, attracts hundreds of thousands of spectators each year. The Street Parade fighter, not only a 3-time consecutive champion, has won the tournament 5 times. The defending champion named Kelvin caught young Melicia's eye when she noticed the orb embedded in the middle of Kelvin's championship belt was one of the 6 orbs called King Yellow. After he returned to the boxing gym, Rick and his group went to inquire about the orb. However, Ossan thought it was a waste of time and got straight to the point, hoping to have the gem on the championship belt handed over to him, as it was previously owned by a member of their team. They would also prepare a gem of equivalent value as a replacement. Hearing this, the gym owner thought they were picking a fight and was about to have Rick and his group thrown out, but Kelvin stopped him. He believed what Ossan said because his nose was a bit special and could tell if someone was lying. Even so, he wouldn't easily hand over the belt. The championship belt is a source of pride for the citizens of this country. To obtain this belt, one must reach the pinnacle of the Boxing King Championship. Hearing this, Ossan did not persist further and took Rick to participate in the championship. The championship was divided into East and West conferences, with each person participating in different regions. However, the primary task was to take the test to qualify as a fighter eligible to participate in the conference. Simulation battles would randomly select among the rookie fighters. Although Rick's current opponent in the preliminaries had a perfect record, showing strength above the standard would also be considered adequate. As soon as the voice dropped, Angelica never expected to encounter Rick here. Rick had defeated his A-grade brother, and she knew well that she couldn't match him. Thinking to go all out right from the start, she suddenly fell the next second. She thought it was just nerves, but then she fell again. Little did she know, this was Rick's newly mastered technique, continuously sweeping the legs of his opponents trying to stand up, thereby crushing their will to fight. Although it wouldn't cause much damage, it involved rapidly sweeping her legs with astonishing speed. Planning to create distance and then attack, she barely teleported 2.5 centimeters before Rick swept her to the ground again. Despite Angelica's reluctance to admit it, she understood she could not defeat Rick. As she was repeatedly swept to the ground, a complex emotion welled up in her. Seeing Angelica, who even in defeat refused to give up, Rick acknowledged her bravery. Just when he thought to show his real skills, Angelica immediately surrendered. Rick easily obtained his fighter status. However, to participate in the league, he first needed to secure 40 wins during the 6-month preliminary period. With only 1 week left in the preliminaries, Rick had to request 40 battles in 4 days. But in the first match, he encountered the deceitful Grit. Rumors had it that he was a fighter who would illegally use weapons, but no evidence was ever found during searches. Grit, seeing Rick, who seemed to be a new fighter, found it amusing. Destroying newcomers was his favorite thing to do. So, he pulled out an impact stone hidden in his shoe. As the match began, Grit complained about the heat today, casually taking off his jacket, intending to use it to block Rick's vision for a sneak attack. Grit was baffled. His own use of the impact stone could easily shatter a 2.5-ton boulder, yet it was he who ended up with a broken bone. Feeling a bad premonition, he was then overwhelmed by the power of Rick's punch and fainted. So, of course, the final winner was Rick. The man had no idea that Elfelt, who was usually so serious, would dress up as a bunny girl and make his heart skip a beat. However, he didn't know that Elfelt had already had a crush on him for a long time. Previously, Angelica had a perfect record of 40 wins in the preliminaries and successfully obtained a ticket to the regional league. However, it was curious whether Rick really planned to complete 40 matches in 4 days, as each venue could only host 1 match per day, and there were dozens of venues nationwide, with some even over 250 kilometers away. Normally, it would be impossible to manage. No sooner had the words been spoken than Rick declared he would go to the green arena to compete. Time was of the essence, but Rick complained the carriage was too slow, so he started running. Although Angelica was quite interested in Rick's competition, she unfortunately couldn't keep up with him. However, when Elfelt offered to take her there, she suddenly had a very bad feeling. So the two began hopping across rooftops. By the time they arrived at the arena, Rick had already finished the fight, but without stopping, he rushed to the next venue. Seeing this, Angelica's uneasy feeling resurfaced. Elfelt held her and again leaped through the air, and what followed was Rick ending each match with a single move, while Elfelt kept chasing with Angelica in her arms. By the 4th day, Angelica began to doubt life itself, wondering if Rick really could finish 40 matches in 4 days. Fortunately, she was in a different region. However, learning that Rick's S-Class master had also joined the league, she felt like dying. But her participation in the competition wasn't just for victory, it was for that man. Upon hearing this, Elphelt was a bit puzzled about which man she was talking about. But Angelica changed the subject, asking Elphelt if she wasn't bothered about being misunderstood as Rick's girlfriend, since she spent so much time with him. She replied that she didn't mind, because she had a crush on Rick. Just then, a man interrupted their conversation. They thought he was coming to flirt, but it turned out he was there because the staff was short-handed and hoped they could help. By evening, after Rick had completed 600 kilometers of training back and forth, he was about to return to find Elphelt, but was stopped by someone claiming to be the chairman of the Western League Committee, Snape. Since Rick had become the fastest player to pass the Western League in history, Rick thought he had come to greet him. However, after Snape's aide mentioned they hadn't found Angelica, Snape left, asking Rick to send his regards to Angelica. Before Rick could even wonder, the carriage had already departed. When Rick entered the restaurant, Militia, worried, ran over to him. She had just seen Snape talking to Rick. Although Snape looked like a gentleman, there were constant rumors about his association with dark forces. Not only was he the main sponsor of this year's competition, but he had also sent players to participate, seemingly with some ulterior motive. At this moment, excited voices erupted behind them. This year's bunny girls were said to be of exceptionally high quality, especially the new dark elf Ossan, undoubtedly referring to Elphelt and Angelica. An employee with a bloodied face pleaded so pitifully that Angelica, soft-hearted, agreed to help. Seeing her agree, Elphelt felt embarrassed to refuse, but at that moment, a man, drunk, tried to harass Angelica and was knocked down in just 0.25 seconds. Coincidentally, Rick, who had just arrived and saw Elphelt dressed as a bunny girl, was especially thrilled. The next day arrived, and the regional league officially began. Only one person from each region could advance to the finals. Angelica was the first to go on stage and launched an attack, but her opponent caught her off guard and counterattacked fiercely. This made Rick feel that something was wrong, as Angelica's fighting style was completely unlike her usual demeanor. When it was Rick's turn, he simply knocked out his opponent with a karate chop, easily securing a victory. Although they kept winning over the next few days, Angelica seemed unusually hurried in her matches. Now, with only 4 matches left and needing to win all of them to ensure a spot in the finals, Angelica faced a tough, thick-skinned opponent. Her proud speed held no advantage against him. She thought to incorporate magic tactics into her hit-and-run strategy to trap the opponent and finish the fight with one blow. However, she hadn't anticipated that the opponent's defense was so high that it caused no damage, and Angelica, due to her continuous use of magic, didn't realize her own speed had slowed down. In a moment of distraction, she was harshly punched by the fat man and thrown against the wall. The match was decided. After her injuries were treated, Rick was somewhat puzzled. He felt that Angelica had been overly anxious in her recent matches. She knew she wasn't good against highly defensive opponents, yet she still chose an aggressive strategy that exhausted her stamina. Even when the situation was unfavorable, she could have won with her usual skills. During their conversation, Rick learned that Snape, whom they had encountered a few days earlier, was her fiancé. A year ago, her parents had died in an accident, and she and her siblings had to take over managing their family estate. Due to their lack of experience, they fell into a financial crisis, so their miserly grandfather intervened and accepted a substantial financial offer from the Snape family in exchange for Angelica's engagement. Although she had worked hard to improve their finances, she couldn't cancel the engagement in time. However, to stop the engagement, Angelica had investigated Snape and discovered he was the main sponsor of the tournament. But before she could finish, they were interrupted by a noisy altercation behind them. They turned to see a dragonkin causing trouble in the tavern. A woman had accidentally bumped into him and was harshly grabbed. A fat man, unable to stand by, tried to intervene, but the dragonkin effortlessly lifted him and slammed him to the ground, planning to continue tormenting the woman. Seeing this, Angelica demanded the dragonkin release the woman. The situation escalated, and the dragonkin threw a punch at Angelica. At the last moment, Rick caught the punch, and Snape's voice followed, telling the dragonkin, "Geese," to stop. Hearing this, Geese reluctantly ceased his actions. After negotiating compensation, Rick learned from Snape that Geese was his brother, but due to his temperament, even a fly could provoke his anger. His immense strength made him a headache to deal with. After Snape left, Angelica resumed her earlier conversation. Her engagement dowry was a significant amount, but her investigations revealed that the Dragon Commerce didn't have that much money. They likely planned to earn the funds through the tournament, meaning using sponsored players in rigged matches. That's why she had entered the competition, to beat that player first and cancel the engagement. Unfortunately, the sponsored player was Geese. Despite her reluctance to admit it, she wasn't his match. Hearing this, Rick decided to train Angelica. The man never imagined that Angelica, who was usually the epitome of grace, would undergo a drastic transformation in both body and personality after just 2.5 days of brutal, inhumane training. She exuded a wildness like that of a python. Facing a popular contestant in the standard level competition, it only took her a moment, and the opponent seemed to see his grandmother waving at him. Just 2.5 days earlier, Rick, in an effort to train Angelica, had her hands and feet forcibly fitted with 30-kilogram hammers. Before she could even react, Rick had already dragged her into a sprint, giving her a bad feeling right away. Unbeknownst to her, Rick discovered that while Angelica's acceleration was good, her movements after accelerating were unstable. So by being dragged along by someone faster, a novice could quickly get used to the high-speed running technique. Sure enough, after running for 6 hours, Angelica seemed to see her grandmother waving at her. Even her originally flawless feet were now covered in scars, which made Rick recall the time when Elfelt trained him so hard that he lost consciousness. Unexpectedly, Angelica's willpower was so strong. Thought today's intensive training would end there, but when he mentioned continuing the training after lunch, it felt like the sky was falling for her. Officially, it was a strategic retreat to maintain her mental state. However, Angelica never expected that just 15 minutes after she ran away, Rick would find her. She thought Rick would scold her, but instead, he was very understanding of her desire to escape, as he himself had escaped dozens of times during his own training, albeit at the cost of dying thousands of times. He had also thought about giving up, but Master Ashork told him to weigh the regret of giving up against the pain of the present and see which side he could better accept. After some thought, the decision was quick because pain is temporary, but missing out would be regretted for a lifetime. Hearing this, Angelica clenched her fists and made up her mind. To become the first female top-class knight in history, she would endure any amount of painful training. Thus, Rick tailored the training to suit Angelica's fighting style. Although Angelica primarily focused on swordsmanship, the fist fighter's rule required unarmed combat. Thus, the technique of turning the empty hand into a sword was perfectly suited to Angelica. He then requested Elfelt, a sword maiden, to provide special training. Quickly, 2.5 days passed, and Angelica returned to the arena where the winner would advance directly to the championship. However, everyone was shocked at the sight. The usually graceful Angelica now exuded an intimidating aura. At the start of the match, she defeated her opponent with just one move, albeit a bit too excitedly. The calmed-down Angelica felt like she had socially died as people around her seemed to look at her with strange eyes. Soon, Drakwil and Mizet, who had recently gone to another country in search of a magical orb but returned empty-handed, approached her. Then Master Ashork arrived at the tavern. After the preliminaries ended, the championship was to begin immediately. During this period, Master Ashork also learned that Rick was helping Angelica with special training and could tell she was not very confident in her own strength. Although her training time was indeed short, her efforts would not betray her. Ashork believed that Angelica could break her own fate. In the blink of an eye, the fist-fighting championship officially began. As the country's top-tier event, the venue was nearly sold out. Although the host claimed that the draw for grouping was fair and just, Angelica noticed that, according to the tournament setup, Geese from the Dragonkin Commerce Guild would not encounter any of the championship favorites. All the troublesome opponents were conveniently placed in the other bracket. Undoubtedly, the Dragonkin Commerce Guild might have intended to create an overwhelmingly strong impression of Geese to the audience from the start, increasing the betting odds to facilitate the manipulation of fixed matches. However, Angelica was set to meet Geese in the second round, where she could thwart their plans. The first round of matches officially began. The opponents could not breach the defense, but with just one punch, one contestant won his match with overwhelming force, instantly earning cheers from everyone present. The upcoming matches for Angelica and Rick were undoubtedly handled with ease. Master Ashok even punched his opponent up to the stratosphere, drawing everyone's attention. The spotlight was also on Kelvin, the three-time reigning champion, who had honed his canine tribe's unique sense of smell to perfection. He could detect feints just by smelling, as he was able to convert everything into scents, including brain waves or adrenaline changes, similar to having a type of observation hockey that allowed him to briefly smell fragments of the future. The next day finally brought Angelica's showdown with Geese. Rick was somewhat surprised that Snape from the Dragonkin Commerce Guild approached him, despite having a special VIP seat, claiming he wanted to watch his brother and fiancé's match up close. Unbeknownst to them, a confrontation had already occurred backstage. Although Geese looked down on Angelica, he would follow his brother's request to try not to hit her stomach, considering she might bear his brother's dragonkin children in the future. This infuriated Angelica, who was determined to give him a thorough beating during the match. As the match began, Angelica launched the first attack, but it was ineffective. After some thought, she deactivated her enhanced state and used a magic reversal reflection to launch an attack. This unexpectedly wounded the arrogant Geese in the abdomen, something he had not anticipated. Geese could never have imagined that Angelica, whom he considered useless, could easily break through his seemingly invincible body. Little did he know that after undergoing Rick's hellish training, Angelica's body had undergone a drastic transformation. She had planned to rely on high-speed movement and line slash to defeat Geese completely, but this only enraged him further. With a sudden punch to the ground, he used the resulting smoke to appear behind Angelica. In just a moment, a powerful punch sent Angelica flying, and he mockingly taunted her unyielding demeanor. Unbeknownst to him, Angelica's prized instant leg technique seemed as slow as a turtle's pace in his eyes, shocking her. Caught off guard, she was fiercely hit again. This was all because Geese, who had been gifted with innate combat talents from a young age, had easily mastered the instant leg technique. Hands in his pockets, he seemed utterly dismissive of any opponent, and he even cruelly mocked Angelica's deceased parents, which infuriated her greatly. Meanwhile, Snape on the high platform already knew that Angelica suspected the Dragon Commerce was rigging the match, though he didn't care. To the audience, it seemed unlikely that a no-name sponsored fighter could win, so Snape had placed his bets on Geese winning when the odds were high. At this moment, Angelica was powerless to defend herself against Geese's onslaught. Seeing Angelica battered yet unwilling to give up, Geese felt an indescribable emotion surge within him, wanting to utterly destroy her to illustrate the gap between a genius and an ordinary person. However, Geese could never have predicted that Angelica would swing her feeble fists in a burst of anger, prompting him to smash her against a wall in a relentless display of power. Rick, seeing the outcome decided, shouted for Geese to stop. Yet Geese, more excited, charged at Angelica. Just in the nick of time, a shoe thrown at Geese altered the trajectory of his attack, potentially saving Angelica's life. Geese, seeing his attack thwarted, turned his furious gaze towards Rick, who stood barefoot on the platform, his eyes filled with murderous intent. In the corridor of the arena, Geese cursed Rick for daring to interfere with his fun, and he wanted to take his anger out on Rick. However, he kicked at nothing as Rick, suppressing his murderous intent, coldly stated that defeating him here meant nothing. He promised to beat him in front of an audience the next day. When it was Rick's turn to fight, he chose not to use a lenient technique, but overwhelmed his opponent with a crushing attitude. The semifinals were now set, with King Kelvin facing Master Ashok and Rick against Geese. The next day, as Rick prepared to enter the arena, he was surprised to find Angelica waiting for him. Angelica apologized to Rick, regretting that he had spent so much time training someone without talent like her. Perhaps it was fate's cruel joke, and marrying Snape might not be a bad idea. However, Rick felt he was the one who should apologize for underestimating Geese's strength. He acknowledged Angelica's hard work and training, so he wanted her to watch the upcoming fight closely. He would show her the future she could have if she continued her training. However, before the fight started, Geese couldn't resist taunting that he had held back the day before. If he had used his full strength from the start, Angelica's life wouldn't be troubled by a lack of talent. He was genuinely sorry he hadn't killed her. Hearing this, Rick was filled with rage as the match was officially announced to start. In just an instant, Rick threw a fierce punch at Geese, watching as Geese uncontrollably knelt on the ground. Rick couldn't help but mock. Even a genius falls before a mere mortal. Geese thought Rick's hit was just a fluke, but he hadn't expected that not only could Rick easily dodge his attacks, but with a mere palm strike, he made Geese spit blood uncontrollably. This scene stunned Angelica, who was marveling at Rick's incredible power when Mazette mentioned that he had barely used any strength. It was a technique of body control called Tongji, which sends the force of a strike through the surface of the body directly into the interior. Thus, no matter how tough Geese's body was, it couldn't withstand the internal impact. Frustrated and humiliated by Rick's two face slaps, Geese became utterly infuriated and unleashed his race's inherent enhancement magic, combined with the instant leg technique to slam Rick against a wall. However, Rick, reacting quickly in midair, dissipated the force and, using the recoil, sprinted back to the center of the arena. Unexpectedly, Geese was even faster and intended to strike first, but ended up being thrown to the ground by Geese's sweeping leg. Faced with an enhanced Geese, Rick was surprised to find that his initial Tongji could not penetrate Geese's body, and even Angelica's line slash and his own Tongji had been mastered by Geese. Although Rick appeared to be in a bad state, the masters realized that Rick was not using his full strength. It seemed as if he wanted Angelica to understand herself. While it looked like Rick was merely taking a beating, Geese was already out of breath, whereas Rick was almost unharmed due to his use of a body control technique called Liuji, which spreads the impact within the body. Unbeknownst to Geese, Rick was deliberately holding back, even limiting his strength to the same level as Angelica, to show her what she could achieve. Hearing this, Geese's veins bulged in rage, and he suddenly unleashed Iron Block and Steel Fist, intending to kill Rick, who had humiliated him. However, Geese hadn't considered that the intense magic consumption of his enhancement spells had drastically reduced his magic power, rendering his body unable to withstand the penetrating damage of Tongji. Rick acknowledged that Geese was indeed formidable, relying on his innate abilities to become so powerful. Unfortunately, any learned techniques could not maintain precision. From a genius's perspective, Geese was still at level 1, while a true genius continuously refines their natural physique or talents, pushing beyond limits. Rick called him a frog in a well. Enraged by these words, Geese momentarily tapped into the ancient dragon lineage within him, emitting an intimidating aura. In just an instant, with the speed of lightning, he sent Rick flying, his body becoming as hard as metal. His fists felt like mere tickles on Geese's body, and even his attack speed became incredibly fast. This made Rick realize that Angelica, at her current level, couldn't win against Geese. Thinking Rick was about to give up, Geese didn't realize that Rick was actually planning to unleash his full power to show Angelica the potential of her future strength if she continued training. Rick attacked Geese with the abilities he had honed over 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months, helping Angelica on the spectator stands to fully understand her potential. Ordinary efforts could not surpass the natural physical differences. It required persistent, extraordinary effort to eventually triumph. Subsequently, Rick knocked Geese down with a punch. Frustrated by Rick's words, Geese's fists kept swinging at Rick, but ultimately, he was defeated by Rick mimicking Angelica's attacks. He believed that Angelica could definitely defeat Geese as well. The man never expected that his unique, proudly mastered skill would be so feeble and ineffective in front of his opponent. Just an ordinary punch almost parted the earth down the middle, and that's when he realized the beast man before him was actually the strongest S-class adventurer on the continent. Merely standing there, he emitted an aura so daunting it could frighten anyone at mere glance. However, just 2.5 minutes earlier, after Rick had thoroughly defeated the draconic Geese, Angelica's engagement was finally called off. With the arrival of the Master Ashork and the Boxing King Kelvin, the audience erupted into enthusiastic cheers. Yet Kelvin's brow was furrowed, with sweat drenching his back. As the match began, Kelvin initiated the attack. As expected, all his hits were easily blocked by Ashork, who, with a casual swing of his fist, whipped up a cloud of dust with the wind. He had expected a thrilling fight, but the arena underwent an unexpected change. Geese, who should have been severely injured, suddenly burst into the arena, triggered by the side effects of his ancient draconic bloodline. attacking Kelvin irrationally. Unexpectedly, Kelvin knocked the fully transformed Geese away with just one punch, surprising Rick a bit. Defeating Geese so effortlessly suggested that Kelvin might have already stepped into the S-Class domain. Unfortunately, due to Geese's sudden intrusion, many spectators were injured, and the match was postponed to the following day. As their masters dined, Rick managed to squeeze in a 700-kilometer slow run. He coincidentally met Kelvin, who was training in the wild. Seeing Rick, he suddenly attacked, marking it as a warm-up for the next day's match. After a brief exchange, Rick sensed something was off. Kelvin possessed the future sense of the canine tribe. He could have dodged the attacks during the match, yet he intentionally got knocked down in the arena. Was it because his nose was blocked at that time? Hearing this, Kelvin was somewhat speechless. For him, who grew up in a slum, fighting was the only joy. By chance, he was brought to the sacred ground of fist fighting by his boss, and not only did he win the championship in his first tournament, but he also initially felt quite good about it. However, match after match, knocking out opponents started feeling like mere work. Over time, no matter how strong he became, he could no longer find joy in the arena. One day, overhearing his boss's conversation, because he ended each fight with a single strike, it left the audience without a proper experience, leading to a decline in viewership. To not trouble his boss, he chose to throw some matches, since the audience would never expect that a reigning champion would fall from grace. When he was knocked down, the atmosphere in the arena reached an unprecedented fervor. Since then, each match was purposefully made extremely difficult, but he would pull through to victory at the last moment, all to stir up the crowd's excitement. Thus, it resulted in him never fighting at full strength. Hearing this, Rick couldn't help but feel that being a strong fighter was truly tough. As the next day dawned, for safety, the spectator stands were enhanced with defensive magic. As the match commenced, Kelvin rushed at Ashok, punching continuously, but to no avail. When he unleashed his unique punching technique, Rick was surprised. However, Ashok noticed Kelvin's punches seemed confused, as if his nature was completely suppressed. Reflecting on what Rick had once said about professional fighters, Kelvin realized why he had to limit his own strength for the sake of the audience. If he suddenly went all out, the audience would realize that he had been holding back in previous fights. Kelvin thought that his opponent might sneer at him for deceiving the audience, but to Ashok, prioritizing the audience's experience over one's own achievements was a true mark of professionalism. Therefore, Ashok decided to fight using only the strength of 2 fingers, and without moving from his spot, perhaps to make the fight evenly matched. Upon hearing this, Kelvin couldn't help but laugh, thinking Ashok was joking. However, when they clashed again, Kelvin realized he had underestimated the situation. His pride in his boxing techniques was challenged, as Ashok effortlessly blocked his punches with just 2 fingers. The burst of power from Ashok left Kelvin unprepared and overwhelmed, stirring a complex emotion within him. The chance to fight with a strong opponent was rare, and he wanted to try more techniques in the match without letting the audience catch on to his previous act of holding back. Just then, his boss erupted in anger, knowing that Kelvin had been pretending to fight with full force. He was furious because it seemed Kelvin had forgotten his original dream, which was to cultivate the strongest fighter in history, even at the cost of his own life. So, he wished for Kelvin to fight to his fullest. With a slight smile, Kelvin could finally stop hiding his strength. Facing a serious Kelvin, Ashok merely adjusted his defensive power accordingly. The fight intensified, but the audience sensed something was off and began accusing the champion of deceiving them. In the next moment, a fierce blaze shot towards Ashok, who countered by creating an earthen barrier that split the fire in 2. Seeing this, Kelvin used his steel fists to break the barrier, causing a visual distraction, and seized the opportunity to magically bind Ashok in place, planning to cast a high-level magic spell to defeat him. The terrifying combat power amazed the entire arena. Kelvin was far stronger than Rick had imagined. The next second, Ashok broke free from the bindings, using his immense strength to disrupt the overwhelming force. This shocked Kelvin, while Ashok, feeling Kelvin's full commitment to the fight, offered the highest form of respect from his tribe. In an instant, the oppressive force made Kelvin's breathing rapid. For the first time in his life, he felt what fear was. Kelvin had never expected that even with his future-sensing extreme dodge ability, Ashok's mere punch wind could blow him away so completely. Even as he fought with all his might, it was futile. When Kelvin's magical energy was exhausted, Ashok knocked him away with a punch. Kelvin, surprised at the hit, used his flow strike and instant leg techniques to mitigate the damage, but his bones and internal organs were still severely impacted. Exhausted but determined, he knew this was what he had always sought, a battle with a powerful opponent. Even if his magical energy was depleted, as long as he could stand, it meant he could still fight. At this moment, the audience, seeing Kelvin's disadvantage, shifted from anger to cheering for him. Finally, in that moment, he exploded with the last of his strength, choosing to sacrifice his soul in a final, desperate attack. After the smoke cleared, Ashok still stood unyielded. This was probably the most exhilarating moment for Kelvin. In a gesture of utmost respect, Ashok knocked him down with a single punch. Just after Ashok predictably won the match, Rick thought that by forfeiting in the final, he could easily claim the orb reward. But he never expected that upon hearing his master express anticipation for their final showdown, his pupils would shrink, and sweat would cover his back, frightening Angelica terribly. After returning to the inn, Rick immediately isolated himself, and no matter how much Angelica called, Rick refused to come out. At that moment, Snape approached, intending to encourage Rick with a few words, but was surprised to find him so fearful of participating in the final. So, through the door, Snape explained to Rick, this year's final is incredibly significant, not only affecting the jobs of thousands, but also offering substantial rewards and attracting hundreds of thousands of fans nationwide. I hope Rick will attend the final. However, Rick valued his life more than the competition. Angelica didn't understand. Although Ashok's training had once traumatized him, he had still persevered for 2.5 years. Now it was just a matter of facing off in the competition. And yet he was so frightened that he wouldn't leave the house. She had held Rick in high esteem, almost like a master, but now she felt profoundly disappointed. Upon hearing this, Master Mizet asked Rick, "Have you never wondered? The day you first arrived at the castle, Ashok had already planned out a 2.5-year training schedule. In Rick's eyes, perhaps it was to cultivate a partner capable of defeating the legendary Kaiser Yaren. But Ashok actually hoped to nurture an opponent with whom he could fight heartily, since orcs have a habit of fighting others to understand them. Unfortunately, Ashok was far too strong, never having an equal fight since his childhood, and had always been quite lonely. His dream was to have a hearty fight with someone, and this dream might come true tomorrow. Thus, he looked forward to the final with Rick. Hearing this, Rick fell into deep thought. On the day of the final, the audience was extremely excited, because today's winner would not only take home a grand prize of 300 million, but also additional prizes. 100 kilograms of magical stones, a year's supply of golden slime sandbags, and a luxury hot spring trip voucher for 2. As Rick was nervously preparing to enter the stage, Elphelt playfully told him, if Rick wins the championship, she would wear a swimsuit and join him in the hot springs. Rick's eyes sparkled, and he resolutely stepped into the arena, as if declaring his determination never to concede. As the host announced the start of the match, Rick took the initiative. This scene stunned Angelica, because Rick's speed created ripples around him, and his fierce offensive soon injured Ashok's arm. Snape thought Rick had used some magic, but in reality, the two were simply engaging in a physical enhancement brawl, exchanging dozens of blows in a second. Finally, Rick seized the opportunity to cut through that indestructible body. However, Angelica was a bit curious as to why Rick's aura had become so fierce and astonishing. Had Elphelt taught Rick any secret techniques before the match? Elphelt directly told her about the agreement she and Rick had made. If he won, they would go to the hot springs together. The thought of staying overnight on the hot spring trip made Angelica blush. Meanwhile, Ashok also felt Rick's determination. He was about to take the initiative in the attack. Just the shockwaves from his punches caused violent vibrations around the arena. At this moment, Rick realized that facing his master Ashok, relying solely on brute force, would lead to a dead end. Just as he finished speaking, Ashok raised his fist and instantly unleashed a series of punch attacks. Rick kept dodging, but what he didn't expect was that the punches were a trap. Using the smoke blasted toward the ground, Ashok suddenly appeared next to Rick and delivered a heavy punch aimed directly at his face. At the critical moment, Rick instantly cast a first-level spell, Air Cushion, barely avoiding Ashok's attack. Ashok couldn't help but praise him, as casting a spell instantly without any incantation was something not even he could achieve. Seeing Rick launch another attack, Ashok exploded with energy and used stones to block Rick's path. Rick was swept away by a massive force, but he managed to teleport in midair, avoiding Ashok's attack and successfully counterattacked. Angelica was completely astonished. Was this what a battle in the S-tier realm looked like? Both sides continuously executed exquisitely precise attacks and tactics. Ashok felt very gratified about Rick's current strength. Although he considered his training plan for Rick to be perfect, it was also thanks to Rick's relentless willpower. Hearing this, Rick was very happy. He knew well that his master would not just make polite remarks. Continuing like this would not do. It was just his master's affirmation of his disciple. Recalling what Master Mizet had said, Ashok's dream was to have an equal fight with someone. Thus, he wanted to fulfill his master's dream by engaging in a vigorous and equal brawl. With respect, he would offer his master the most sincere fight. Moved by these words, Ashok realized that Rick had indeed become an outstanding member of the team. He decided to tell Rick about the creation of the Olihakan Fist. The man raised his thumb and challenged the Deity. At the moment of their fist bump, it signified that both parties had given up on dodging and defense. There were no fancy spells and no intricate combat skills, just a true man-to-man brawl with punches landing solidly. The mere shockwave of the charge forced Mizet to deploy extensive divine magic to keep the spectators away from the battleground. In return for an equal fight, Rick met the conditions to use his innate skill and once again unleashed the impressive Barbarian Awakening move. Before the fight began, Ashok revealed his own background and the history of the Orichalcum Fist. Realizing at the age of 5 that he was different from the other orcs, Ashok, with wisdom unlike his kin, understood human language and culture after accidentally finding a book left by humans. He named himself and his tribe after humans, although orcs have a custom of deepening relationships through fighting. However, his strength was so extraordinary that he couldn't experience emotions through it. To improve life, he taught the orcs how to make fire, build houses, and communicate using language. Unaware, Ashok was revered as a deity by everyone, and subsequently had even less interaction with his kind, with even his family and siblings unable to approach him casually. Seeing his kin resolving disputes by fighting and then joyfully dining together made Ashok feel even lonelier. A natural disaster flooded the orc village, and only Ashok survived. Staring at the ruins, he was shocked because even losing his family and companions didn't bring him any sadness, deepening his sense of loneliness. One day, an adventurer trying to capture orcs for a task soon realized something was amiss when he found an orc who could read. Moreover, Ashok had solved the problem of a dragon attacking the town and surprisingly spoke human language. After talking, they cleared up the misunderstanding. The old man was very interested in Ashok and learned his story, understanding his loneliness. The old man proposed they chase their dreams together. It turned out the old man had once fought alongside a hero named Yamato, known as one of the Legendary Five, whose dream was to defeat legendary monsters. The old man said that in pursuing his dreams, Ashok would surely meet strong opponents worthy of equal combat. Thus, Ashok also became an adventurer, and together with the old man, they established the Orichalcum Fist. The old man was right. Ashok met equally strong companions in the days that followed, each with their own strengths. But what he yearned for was the physical fist-to-fist combat, like among the orcs. That's why he came up with the hellish training plan. And Rick was the victim of this book. Rick, remembering the last 2.5 years of hellish training and how much Ashok had thought about him, decided to abandon his usual techniques and repay Ashok with a real brawl. He approached Ashok with a thumb up, deciding on a pure hand-to-hand fight. The two on the field gave up talking and conveyed their emotions through primitive fighting, with Rick no longer avoiding death. Only those fully swung punches repaid Ashok for his teachings. The mere shockwave from their clashing fists was enough for Mizet to sense trouble, prompting him to move all the spectators to a safe location. Just as the relocation was completed, the arena's protective shield completely shattered. Only the VIP and family seats remained on site, while the battle continued unabated. In terms of the number of attacks, Rick had the upper hand. but in terms of the power of each strike, Ashok was far ahead. Kelvin, watching the match, was stunned. Could these two really be on the same S level as him? The gap seemed too vast. Despite both being S level, Ashok and Rick had a chasm-like difference in strength. Ashok's punch sent Rick flying out of the arena, leaving him powerless to resist. Rick thought about giving up, wondering if they had fought enough. But seeing Ashok, who still had energy to spare, Rick knew their brawl was far from over. In the next second, he clenched his fist and activated his innate skill. Unbeknownst to Ashok, the other masters had secretly trained Rick in the use of his innate skills. He could now control them to a certain extent, and had met the conditions to activate Barbarian Awakening. Facing an enemy far stronger than oneself, determined to push past one's limits to overcome the opponent, the activation required not magic or physical strength, but Rick's unyielding willpower. Rick's fist landed hard on Ashok's face. It was at this moment that he truly felt the special care from his companions. The two had already surpassed their limits, deciding the match with one final punch. Their simultaneous attack shocked the whole continent. After the exchange of blows, both sustained severe injuries, but Rick was the first to fall. For Ashok, however, Rick had not only achieved his long-held dream, but had also reached a level Ashok had never imagined. In Ashok's heart, this battle was Rick's victory. Afterwards, Rick lay unconscious in a hospital bed for 3 full days, with Elfelt by his side. On the bed was a champion belt left by Ashok. When the other masters arrived, Rick did not accept this victory. Although happy to hear his master's acknowledgement, he knew that Ashok could easily restore himself to full condition at least 30 times with healing magic if he wished. Finally, Ashok thanked everyone present. He appreciated Rick for helping him fulfill his dream and thanked all his companions for their efforts. Their purpose for the past several days had finally been achieved. Ashok took the second gem from the belt and asked Drak to infuse magic into a replica. Both Rick and Ashok relinquished their titles as fighters, and Kelvin stepped up as the new 4-time champion. Before leaving the town the next day, Ashok said goodbye to his 2 juniors. Rick, meanwhile, bought many souvenirs to share with his neighbors. Angelica split from the group early to go home, but she promised Drak she would visit later and asked Ashok to teach her. Rick was shocked by this, but Angelica seemed unfazed. She had decided to catch up to Rick and eventually surpass him. Rick sensed her determination and expressed his support for Angelica's decision, looking forward to that day. As for the method of their return, it did not disappoint Angelica. They would run a distance of 2,800 kilometers. Angelica could not help but complain, wondering if they were trying to exhaust the horses into ascension. That's when she saw Mizet cast a strengthening spell on the horses, seemingly making a journey of thousands of kilometers effortless. Elfelt's words led Rick to ponder, but he could not accept the victory just yet. Before he could finish, Mizet, undeterred by the grand scale of events, suggested that since the duel ended in a draw, they race back on foot. If Rick won, he would win Elfelt's heart. If he lost, his training would increase 100-fold. Thus, Rick had no choice but to promise Elfelt that he would definitely take her to a hot spring.